The letter had the cold, institutional feel of a medical diagnosis. You know the kind. The bad kind. The kind they deliver in a sealed, heavyweight envelope after a nurse with sad eyes tells you to have a seat. But this wasn't from a doctor. It was from a far more terrifying, far more judgmental entity. The Seacliff Bluffs Homeowners Association. I was standing on my front lawn, or what passed for one, when I received the verdict. It wasn't delivered by a sad nurse, but by the architect of my suburban misery herself, Carol. She was positioned on the public sidewalk, arms crossed over a tautly stretched windbreaker, her posture a masterclass in righteous indignation. A sun visor, pulled down low, shadowed a face that seemed permanently puckered, as if she'd just bitten into a lemon that owed her money. In one hand she held a clipboard, the clipboard of damnation. It was her scepter, her Excalibur. I'd only been in Seacliff Bluffs, Oregon for 3 months, but I'd already learned to fear the clipboard. "Mr. Maxwell," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the tranquil morning air like a shard of glass. It was the kind of voice that could curdle milk from 50 paces. I unfolded the laminated sheet of paper. Laminated. Of course it was. Carol believed in the permanence of her judgments. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a historical document, meant to be preserved for the ages. The black, laser-printed text stared up at me, stark and unforgiving. Official notice of violation. Property, 112 Cliffside Drive. Violation, Landscaping Ordinance, Section 4, Subsection B, Paragraph 3, A, Turf height. Description, observed grass height measured at 3.75 inches. Maximum allowable height is 3.5 inches. Action required, rectify within 48 hours to avoid further sanctions. I looked down at my patchy, sad little lawn, a motley collection of fescue, clover, and things I could only identify as greenish. Then I looked back at the letter. A 1/4 inch. I was a 1/4 inch outlaw, a desperado of the decorative grasses. "Carol," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Are you serious?" "We like to keep a certain standard here, Mr. Maxwell," she replied, her gaze sweeping over my property as if it were a blighted slum. "It's what maintains our property values." I let out a slow breath. "Right, because a 1/4 inch of unkempt fescue is the only thing standing between this neighborhood and a full-blown real estate apocalypse. Got it?" I gave her a mock salute. "I'll get my tiny scissors and a micrometer right out. Wouldn't want to crash the housing market." Her lips tightened into a thin, bloodless line. It was her version of a smile. 48 hours, Mr. Maxwell." She pivoted with military precision, and power walked away, her clipboard held firmly at her side. I watched her go, a beige tyrant in sensible sneakers, disappearing down a street lined with houses painted in the 3 approved shades of off-white, seashell sand dollar, and the wildly adventurous, slightly darker sand dollar. This wasn't what I'd signed up for. I'd cashed out my tech stocks at 38, weary of the 80-hour work weeks, the endless meetings about synergy and disruption, and the soul-crushing traffic of the city. I'd bought this place, a slightly neglected but structurally sound fixer-upper, for the view. From the back of the house, you could see the Pacific stretching out to infinity, a vast expanse of gray and blue that made all your problems feel small. I came here for the quiet roar of the ocean, the salty air, the foggy mornings. I came here to finally have the time and space to work with my hands, to build things. My dream project, the entire reason I bought this specific house, was to build a deck. Not just any deck. I envisioned a monument to glorious, irresponsible relaxation. A massive, 2-tiered redwood behemoth wrapping around the back of the house, with a built-in fire pit, space for a grill the size of a smart car, and wide, comfortable stairs leading down to the yard. It would be a masterpiece of calculated leisure. And to build it, I knew I'd have to go through her. Through the HOA, through the clipboard and the laminated notices and the turf height regulations. I looked from my fixer-upper, a house full of potential and sawdust, to the ocean stretching out beyond it. Then I looked down at the ridiculous laminated notice in my hand. A declaration of war over a 1/4 inch of grass. I crumpled it into a tight ball. The lamination fought back, but I was determined. A slow smile spread across my face. She wanted to play by the book? Fine. I'd read the damn book. I'd read it, I'd memorize it, and I'd use it to build the most beautiful, rule-compliant, and utterly infuriating deck this neighborhood had ever seen. Game on, Carol, game on! Finding the right people for a job like this is crucial. You don't want a team that just sees lumber and nails. You want artists, co-conspirators. You want people who understand that sometimes the most important part of building something is who you're building it at. I found my guys, Dave and Gary, through a recommendation from a grizzled old-timer at the local hardware store. They're not the cheapest, he'd warned me, but they know the score. Their work truck, a Ford F-150 that looked like it had been used as a battering ram in a former life, rumbled into my driveway a few days later. Dave hopped out of the driver's side. He was a talker, all grins and easy energy, with a tool belt that had seen more action than most soldiers. The passenger door opened with a weary groan, and Gary emerged. Gary was the opposite of Dave. He was a tall, stoic man of few words, with a thick beard that seemed to absorb sound. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, and his primary mode of communication was a slightly raised eyebrow. I led them around to the back of the house and laid out my grand vision. So, 2 tiers, I explained, gesticulating wildly. The top level here, flush with the patio doors. The second level a few steps down, wider. Big enough for a party. I want redwood, clean lines, maybe some built-in benches here and here. A monument to the weekend. Dave whistled, a long, low note of appreciation. That's a deck, all right. I looked at Gary. He stared at the back of the house, then at the view, then back at the house. He slowly stroked his beard, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Gary's impressed by your audacity, Dave translated. There's a catch, I said, lowering my voice conspiratorially. The HOA. Dave's grin didn't falter, but a knowing glint appeared in his eyes. Ah, you've met Carol? She cited me for my grass being a 1/4 inch too tall. Dave barked a laugh. Sounds about right. She once tried to fine my cousin for having unseasonably festive Christmas lights up on December 27th. Said the spirit of the season officially expires at midnight on the 26th. He patted my shoulder. Don't you worry, Leo. We know Carol. We know the book. We also know all the parts she forgets to read. This was my team. The first step was the permit application. This couldn't just be an application. It had to be a work of art. A preemptive strike of bureaucratic overwhelmingness. For a week, my dining room table became our war room. Dave handled the structural realities. Gary made meticulous, beautiful drawings that looked like they belonged in an architectural museum, and I handled what I called narrative framing. We compiled a binder. A glorious 4-inch thick 3-ring binder. It contained everything. Architectural drawings with multiple elevations. Material lists down to the specific brand of galvanized screws we'd be using. A soil stability report from a firm in Portland. We even included a goddamn sunpath analysis, complete with charts and diagrams, showing how the deck's shadow would move across the yard throughout the day, proving it wouldn't cast an unneighborly shadow on the prize-winning petunias belonging to Carol's next-door neighbor and chief sycophant, Bob. The monthly HOA meeting was held in the Sea Cliff Bluffs Community Center, a drab, beige building with a perpetually leaky roof and a lingering smell of stale coffee and regret. The 5 board members sat at a long folding table at the front. Carol was in the center, of course, flanked by Bob and 3 other residents who looked like they'd been press-ganged into service. I walked to the front and placed the binder on the table with a solid, satisfying thud. Carol eyed it like it was a venomous snake. She didn't reach for it. Bob, on her command, slid it gingerly across the table toward her. She opened it with the tips of her fingers, her eyes scanning the table of contents, searching, I knew, for a typo, a missing form, any excuse to reject it out of hand. I saw the flicker of disappointment on her face when she found none. "The Architectural Review Committee will review this," she announced to the room, though she was looking directly at me. The committee consisted of herself, Bob, and a woman who I was fairly sure was sleeping with her eyes open. "We have 30 days to respond, as per the bylaws." "Take your time," I said, giving her my most charming, insincere smile. "You can't rush greatness." As I walked back to my seat, I felt the weight of her glare on my back. The binder sat on the table between us, a 4-inch thick challenge. The 30-day waiting period had begun. This was the opening salvo, the first move in a chess game where all the pieces were made of redwood and laminated paper. To pass the time, I began my own campaign of petty, rules-compliant warfare. The bylaws, I'd discovered, were quite specific about lawn ornaments, but only in the front yard. The next day, a single, glorious, bright pink plastic flamingo appeared in my backyard, perfectly positioned to be visible from Carol's kitchen window. Her car, a sensible beige sedan, started driving past my house just a little more slowly each day. The storm was gathering. 29 days later, a letter arrived. Not laminated this time, but enclosed in a thick manila envelope that felt heavy with stipulations. My application for the deck of glorious relaxation had been approved. I felt a surge of victory, which immediately evaporated as I read the second sentence. Approval is granted contingent upon adherence to the following 27 conditions. I spread the pages out on my kitchen counter. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive bureaucracy. Carol's hand was in every line. I could almost hear her nasally voice dictating the terms. The list was breathtaking in its pettiness. Condition #4. All percussive construction activities, for example, hammering, must cease between the hours of 12 p.m. and 2 p.m. daily to preserve neighborhood quiet time. Condition #9. The shade of redwood stain to be used must be pre-approved from a supplied list of three options: Sierra Red, Canyon Brown, and Timber Rust. The paint chips attached were, to my eye, completely indistinguishable from one another. Condition #17. A certified horticulturalist must be consulted and provide a written report confirming that construction activities will not unduly disturb the native fern population in the immediate vicinity. The native ferns were, for the most part, weeds I had been planning to obliterate with a weed whacker. Condition #22. All construction debris must be kept in designated containers and must not be visible from the street at any time. I called an emergency summit with Dave and Gary. We sat around my dining room table, the list of conditions spread between us like an enemy battle plan. "This is insane," I said. "She's trying to legislate us into submission. A 2-hour hammering ban? We'll be building this thing until 2028. Dave just chuckled and took a long sip of his coffee. "Leo, my friend, you see a list of rules. I see a list of opportunities." He tapped condition #4. Percussive activities. She means hammering. She didn't say anything about cutting, or drilling, or the beautiful music of a high-powered pneumatic nail gun. Gary, who had been silently studying the list, pointed a thick finger at condition #17, the fern mandate. He then pulled out his phone typed for a moment and showed it to Dave. Dave squinted at the screen. "Gary's nephew, Kevin. He's taking a botany class online at the community college. For $50, he'll come out here and certify these weeds as thriving and emotionally prepared for the construction process." My spirits began to lift. This wasn't a battle plan. It was a playbook. The next Monday, construction began. At precisely 12 p.m., the moment the hammering band kicked in, the rhythmic thwack of hammers was replaced by the high-pitched scream of a Makita table saw ripping through redwood planks, the air filled with the scent of fresh-cut wood and the sound of progress. When the saw went quiet, the rapid-fire thump-thump-thump of the nail gun would start up. It wasn't technically a hammer, and it was glorious. As a cherry on top, we started playing a curated playlist of sea shanties on a large Bluetooth speaker during the 2-hour window. The sound of a dozen drunk sailors singing about whaling carried beautifully on the ocean breeze. For the stain approval, I dutifully stained 3 sample planks with the exact same color from a can I already owned, and labeled them Rustic Sunset, Coastal Ember, and Woodland Fire. I submitted them to Carol. She spent a week of intense deliberation, occasionally holding them up to the light in her driveway before officially approving the Coastal Ember. And Kevin, Gary's nephew, was a triumph. A lanky kid with a serious expression, he spent 20 minutes walking around the yard, solemnly inspecting the weeds. He'd occasionally nod and jot something down in a little notebook. He handed me a 1-page double-spaced report titled An Abbreviated Ecological Assessment of the Indigenous Flora at 112 Cliffside Drive, which concluded that the local ferns were exhibiting a high degree of resilience and were unlikely to be negatively impacted by proximal construction activities. It was the best $50 I'd ever spent. We tackled condition hash 22, no visible debris, with artistic flair. Instead of a pile, we created a sculpture. Each day's wood scraps were carefully arranged into a large, abstract shape on a tarp in the backyard. It was a twisted, vaguely gnome-like monstrosity about 6 feet tall. Was it a pile of debris? Or was it art? It was a beautiful, unanswerable question. The deck was taking shape. The first tier was complete, and the support posts for the second were in place. And Carol was losing her mind. Her beige sedan was now a permanent fixture, parked just up the street, her silhouette visible through the driver's side window. Watching. Always watching. She was waiting for us to slip up, and she thought she'd finally found her silver bullet. Carol's moment of triumph came in the form of another official-looking envelope, hand-delivered to my mailbox. It was an invitation, no, a summons, to a special emergency hearing of the HOA board. The subject? Proposed structural variance, 112 Cliffside Drive. I knew exactly what it was about. Buried deep in the bylaws, on page 87, was a clause I had admittedly underestimated. Any freestanding or attached structure exceeding a height of 8 feet above the established ground level requires a formal variance hearing, with notification provided to all adjacent property owners. My plans, the beautiful plans drawn by Gary, clearly showed the upper tier of the deck having a final surface height of 8 feet 6 inches. It was the perfect height for the view over the railing. It was also, I now realized, the perfect height for Carol to ambush me. She hadn't missed it. She'd been waiting, letting us get halfway through the project before springing her trap. Stopping us now would be maximum leverage cruelty. The meeting was on a Tuesday night. The community center felt even colder and more depressing than usual. Carol had managed to rally a decent number of residents, mostly her cronies, and a few genuinely concerned neighbors she'd undoubtedly terrified with visions of a monstrous wooden tower blocking their sliver of afternoon sun. She stood at the front, a laser pointer in her hand, next to a projector screen displaying Gary's own architectural drawing. She was using my own weapon against me. "As you can see," she said, circling the height dimension with the red dot, "Mr. Maxwell's proposed structure clearly exceeds the 8-foot limit established in our bylaws. This is a significant violation of the aesthetic and structural harmony of our community." She went on for 10 minutes, her voice ringing with the joy of a prosecutor who knows the defendant is guilty. Bob sat beside her, nodding so vigorously I was worried his head might fall off. When she finished, she turned to me, a smug, reptilian smile on her face. "Mr. Maxwell, do you have anything to say before the board votes on whether to issue a stop work order?" I stood up, holding a single folded piece of paper. "I do, Carol. Thank you." I walked to the front. "First, I want to thank you for your incredible diligence. Your attention to detail is, as always, an inspiration." She preened. "You're absolutely right. An 8-foot 6-inch structure would indeed require a variance, and we would never dream of flaunting the bylaws like that." I unfolded the paper. "Which is why, due to some recently discovered and unforeseen topographical anomalies in my backyard," I let the term hang in the air, "we commissioned a new, updated survey. The original ground-level measurement was slightly inaccurate." I placed the new document on the projector. It was a fresh surveyor's report, officially stamped and signed that afternoon. "As you can see from the updated report," I said, pointing to the key line item, "the final height of the deck, measured from the newly certified ground level, will be exactly 7 feet and 11.5 inches. I let that sink in. I had paid a surveyor an exorbitant rush fee to come out and find a slight dip in the ground right under the deck's footprint, a dip that allowed us to shave exactly 7 inches off the official height calculation without changing the physical structure one bit. I'd lowered the ground to fit the rules. A low murmur went through the room. Someone in the back snickered. Carol stared at the projection, her mouth slightly agape. The red laser pointer dot quivered on the screen. She had been so sure, so confident in her victory. And I had beaten her, not by breaking the rules, but by following them more pedantically than even she could have imagined. The board, seeing their airtight case evaporate, had no choice. The vote against the stop work order was 4-1, with Carol being the lone dissenter. One of the neighbors, a man who Carol had once cited for having a visibly joyful welcome mat, actually let out a small, audible cheer. I walked back to my seat, but not before catching her eye. The smugness was gone. In its place was a look of pure, cold, concentrated rage. This was no longer about bylaws and property values. This was personal. She had been publicly humiliated, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that she would find a way to get her revenge. In the weeks following the Great Fence debate, an unsettling quiet fell over Cliffside Drive. The construction on the deck proceeded without incident. The sea shanties still played during the lunch hour. The gnome sculpture of scraps grew more abstract and beautiful by the day, but the laminated letters ceased. Carol's beige sedan was no longer parked in its surveillance spot. It was the silence of a predator gathering its strength, and it was far more unnerving than the open warfare. The distraction, when it came, arrived via the city, not the HOA. It was a simple quarter-sheet flyer tucked into our mailboxes. Public service announcement. Annual Tsunami preparedness drill. This Saturday at 10 a.m. The notice explained that the network of early warning horns, positioned in coastal communities up and down the state, would be tested. For 1 full minute, a coordinated high-decibel siren would sound. Residents were advised to use this as an opportunity to review their family emergency plans. As fate would have it, one of these horns was located directly across the street from my house. It was a big, ugly, rust-colored cone bolted to the top of a utility pole. An eyesore I had learned to ignore. The next morning, as I was getting my mail, Carol power-walked by. She'd been avoiding me since the meeting, but now she stopped, a thin, malicious smile playing on her lips. "Big day Saturday, Mr. Maxwell," she said, nodding towards the horn. "Hope you have your earplugs ready. It can be awfully loud." She thought this was a win for her, a small, state-sanctioned annoyance that she could lord over me, a noise I couldn't protest, a disturbance I couldn't creatively comply my way out of. I just smiled back. "Oh, I'll be fine, Carol. I appreciate your concern for my hearing, though. It's very neighborly of you." That evening, my work on the deck done for the day, I was doing what any recently retired tech nerd does for fun: browse government surplus auction websites. I was looking for old nautical hardware, maybe a brass porthole or a ship's wheel to turn into a ridiculous coffee table. I was deep in the maritime section, scrolling past lots for anchor chains and bilge pumps, when I saw it. The listing stopped my heart. Lot #774, decommissioned U.S. Coast Guard cutter air horn Siren, model Kahlenberg T3A, requires external compressor, condition loud. The picture showed a trio of massive, gleaming chrome horns mounted together on a heavy-duty bracket. It was magnificent. It looked like the kind of thing you would use to announce the arrival of a sea god or to scare Godzilla back into the ocean. It was absurd, unnecessary, and deeply, deeply tempting. An idea, a terrible, hilarious, and monumentally stupid idea, began to form in the back of my mind. It was a joke, I told myself. Just a gag, a conversation piece. The ultimate trophy from my war with the HOA. I put in a lowball bid of $250, figuring I'd be outbid instantly. I wasn't. I won. A week later, a freight truck rumbled down my street and deposited a massive wooden crate in my driveway. Dave and Gary, who were on site to start work on the railings, just stared. "Leo," Dave said, his voice full of awe. "What in the name of Poseidon's fury is that?" "That, my friends," I said, prying open the crate with a crowbar, "is my emotional support siren." We wrestled it out of the crate. It was even bigger and more glorious in person. The chrome was flawless, the sheer scale of it comical. Gary, the stoic man of few words, walked a slow circle around it, then reached out and gave one of the horns a reverent pat. That afternoon became a side project. We drove to a tool rental shop and came back with the most powerful portable air compressor they had. We spent an hour hooking up hoses and wiring a simple activation switch. We didn't test it, not fully. We just gave it a tiny little burst of air, which produced a surprisingly loud toot that sent a squirrel scurrying up a tree. Satisfied, we wheeled the entire assembly into my garage, hiding it behind my workbench. The gleam of the chrome horns was just barely visible through the crack of the garage door, like a caged beast waiting. It was just for fun, I kept telling myself. Just for fun. Friday night, the eve of the drill. The deck was nearly complete, the last of the railings in place. I was sitting on the upper tier, a cold beer in my hand, admiring our handiwork. The air was still, the sky painted with the soft colors of a coastal sunset. The feud with Carol had been unnervingly quiet, and I found myself scanning the neighborhood, wondering what her next move would be. That's when I saw her. A silhouette, unmistakable even from a distance, was moving near the base of the utility pole across the street. It was Carol. She had a small aluminum stepladder. I squinted, trying to make out what she was doing. She climbed a few rungs, toolbox in hand, and began fiddling with the base of the big, rust-colored Tsunami horn. What on earth is she doing? I thought. Is she polishing it? Is she making sure it meets HOA aesthetic standards for emergency warning devices? The idea was so completely bizarre that I laughed and dismissed it. Maybe a bolt was loose. Maybe she was just being Carol, the self-appointed inspector general of everything. I took another sip of beer and put it out of my mind. Saturday morning arrived, gray and misty. It was 9:55 a.m., the countdown to the drill. I was in my garage, sorting screws into little plastic bins, a meditative task. The Coast Guard siren sat in the corner like a piece of abstract sculpture. A chrome temptation I had no real intention of acting on. It was the ultimate, unloaded gun, a prop in my personal comedy. Dave and Gary were already on site, drinking coffee and leaning against their truck, waiting for the drill to be over so they could finish up the last few details on the deck. A strange, festive anticipation hung in the air. The whole neighborhood was waiting for the big noise. 10 a.m. The second hand on my watch swept past the 12. And then, nothing. Absolute, profound silence. Not the faintest wail, not a distant toot. Just the gentle sound of the surf a half-mile away, and the cry of a lone gull. 10:01 a.m. Still silence. I looked at Dave. He shrugged. I saw neighbors start to wander out onto their porches, looking confused. People were checking their phones, tapping their watches. Was it canceled? Postponed? My eyes went to the utility pole across the street. I grabbed a pair of binoculars I kept on a shelf for whale watching. I focused on the top of the pole. The mounting plate was there. The electrical box was there. But the big, rust-colored horn cone itself was gone. Vanished. In its place were 4 empty bolts pointing at the sky, and then the memory of the night before hit me like a physical blow. Carol. The stepladder, the toolbox. The horrifying, hilarious, galaxy-brained truth dawned on me. She stole the tsunami horn. I couldn't even process the logic. It was so magnificently warped. Did she think I was going to complain about the noise, so she removed it to spite me? Did she think I was planning a prank and this was her way of preemptively disarming me? It was a level of petty, self-defeating insanity I couldn't have conceived of. In her obsessive quest to control her immediate environment and win our stupid little war, she had disabled a piece of federal emergency infrastructure. It was 10:02 a.m. The neighborhood was in a state of confused, anxious murmuring. My gaze shifted from the empty utility pole to the concerned faces of my neighbors, and finally, to the monstrous, gleaming chrome siren sitting in the corner of my garage. An unholy, unstoppable grin spread across my face. This was no longer about a deck. It was no longer about grass height or sea shanties. A civic duty had been thrust upon me. I turned to Dave and Gary, who were watching me with expressions of dawning realization. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice low and full of purpose, "I think the town needs a little help with their drill." It was 10:03 a.m. The window of opportunity was closing. Dave looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and delight. "Leo, you're not actually going to—" he started, but his voice trailed off as he saw the look on my face. Gary, silent as ever, simply cracked his knuckles, a slow, wicked smile spreading across his bearded face. He gave a single, decisive nod. That was all the encouragement I needed. "She stole a public warning system to win an argument over redwood staining," I declared, my voice filled with mock heroic gravity. "This is no longer a prank. This is a public service. This isn't just my right, it's my civic duty." I walked over to the corner of the garage and flipped the switch on the big air compressor. It coughed once, then whirred to life with a steady, rising hum, filling the tank with compressed fury. I grabbed the simple pull cord I'd rigged up as the activator. It felt heavy in my hand, like the lever to some great and terrible machine. I took a deep, theatrical breath, held it for a beat, and yanked the cord. The sound that erupted from my garage was not a siren. It was not a horn. It was a physical force. It was a deep, earth-shaking, multi-toned chord that hit you not in the ears, but in the chest. It was the sound of a 378-foot Coast Guard cutter announcing its imminent arrival in a foggy, narrow channel. It was the sound of mountains grinding together. It was the sound of Armageddon's alarm clock finally going off. It was, in short, glorious. The effect on Seacliff Bluffs was instantaneous and profound. Every car alarm on my block, and likely the next 3, shrieked into life, creating a discordant symphony of panicked electronics. From every backyard came the terrified, mournful howling of dogs. A flock of seagulls that had been peacefully loafing on a nearby roof ceased to exist as a flock, exploding into a chaotic cloud of white feathers and shrieking terror. My garage, the epicenter of the blast, vibrated. I could feel the concrete floor humming under my feet. Through the open door, I saw my next-door neighbor, Bob, who had been placidly watering his prize-winning petunias. At the moment of the blast, he dropped his hose, clutched his chest, and fell to his knees as if he had been smote by a vengeful Old Testament god. It was a beautiful sight. The 3 of us, Dave, Gary, and I, were wearing the heavy-duty, noise-canceling headphones we used for the table saw. To us, the sound was a dull, powerful roar, and we were howling with laughter, tears streaming down our faces as we watched the peaceful suburban tableau descend into pure, unadulterated chaos. For one full, beautiful, deafening minute, the sound of a warship echoed through the quiet coastal town. Then, as suddenly as it began, I let go of the cord. The siren cut off. The silence that followed was somehow even more profound and shocking than the noise itself. It was a heavy, ringing void, punctuated only by the dying wails of a dozen car alarms and the distant, traumatized barking of a single, very confused beagle. Slowly, doors opened. People poured out of their houses. But they weren't confused anymore. They were terrified. They were shielding their eyes, scanning the horizon for the incoming tidal wave. They were looking at the sky for the invading alien fleet. They were looking for the source. And then, one by one, every head on Cliffside Drive turned to the one place a sound that big could have possibly come from. They all turned to stare at my open garage. It took less than 5 minutes for the cavalry to arrive. A single police cruiser, its blue and red lights flashing silently, pulled up to the curb in front of my house. The siren was conspicuously off. I suspect the officer behind the wheel had heard quite enough noise for one day. The car door opened, and a young officer, her name tag reading Ramirez, stepped out. She adjusted her belt, sighed the deep, weary sigh of someone who has seen far too much small-town weirdness, and walked up my driveway. She didn't look angry, she just looked tired. "Maxwell?" she said, her voice flat. "I'm not even going to ask what that was. I'm just going to ask why. Please tell me there's a logical, non-apocalyptic reason my coffee is still vibrating in my cruiser's cup holder." Before I could launch into my carefully prepared speech about civic duty, a new player entered the scene. Carol. She wasn't power walking now. She was storm marching across the street, her face a mottled purple mask of pure rage. Bob trailed weakly in her wake like a sad, beige dinghy. "Officer, arrest this man!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He's creating a public nuisance. He's a menace. He's terrorizing the neighborhood with that thing." I put on my most earnest, concerned citizen expression. "Me? Carol, I was merely providing a vital public service." I gestured dramatically towards the empty utility pole. Someone, and I can't imagine who, stole the official city-owned tsunami warning horn right before the annual drill. I saw our community was uninformed and vulnerable, and I simply stepped in to fill the void. I was ensuring our citizens remained prepared. I said it with a completely straight face, my heart singing with joy. Officer Ramirez's gaze shifted from my face to Carol's sputtering rage, to the empty pole, and back to me. Her "I don't get paid enough for this" expression deepened into a look of genuine disbelief. "Ma'am," she said, turning to Carol, "is that true? Is the horn missing?" This was it, the moment of reckoning. Carol, realizing the trap she had laid for me had just snapped shut on her own leg, began to stammer. "Well, I confiscated it. For safety," she blurted out, her voice cracking. I knew he was planning something. I was protecting the community from his childish pranks." It was the worst possible thing she could have said. It was a full confession, wrapped in a bow of misguided self-importance. Officer Ramirez's tired expression hardened into one of professional seriousness. "Let me get this straight, ma'am," the officer said, her voice now cold and official. "You're telling me you climbed a city utility pole and removed official emergency warning equipment?" She paused for effect. "Carol, that's a felony. Theft of public property, reckless endangerment, interfering with an emergency broadcast system." The color drained from Carol's face. She looked like she'd been tasered. Bob, standing behind her, looked like he was about to faint. "Show me where it is," Ramirez commanded. Defeated, meek, and terrified, Carol turned and led the officer across the street to her own garage. With a shaking hand, she lifted a neatly folded tarp. Underneath, next to a pristine collection of garden trowels and a perfectly coiled hose, lay the sad, rust-colored tsunami horn. Dave and Gary, who had been watching the entire exchange from the safety of their truck, finally lost their battle for composure. They were leaning against the hood, howling with laughter, clutching their sides. I just stood there in my driveway, the picture of civic-minded innocence, a hero in headphones. The aftermath was the stuff of local legend. The story of the Tsunami War of Seacliff Bluffs spread through town like wildfire. Carol was charged, though she eventually got off with a hefty fine, community service, and a court order to never again come within 50 feet of a utility pole. The HOA board, led by a newly emboldened retired surfer named Mike, who had always hated Carol's reign of beige, called an emergency meeting. In a unanimous vote, Bob fearfully abstained, she was removed as president. A few weeks later, the deck was finished. It was magnificent. More beautiful than I had even imagined. I was sitting on a brand new lounge chair on the upper tier, sipping a well-deserved margarita. The salty air was clean, the sound of the surf was gentle, and the neighborhood was peaceful. Mike, the new HOA president, stopped by. He was carrying a surfboard under one arm. "Hey, Leo," he said, admiring the deck. "Looks awesome, man. Totally awesome." "Thanks, Mike. Glad it meets with the new board's approval." "Oh yeah," he laughed. "About that. We voted to dissolve the Architectural Review Committee last night. Life's too short, you know?" He paused. "Also, we're thinking of expanding the approved paint color palette." "Really?" I said, intrigued. "What are you thinking? An eggshell? An ivory?" Mike grinned. "Yeah, maybe. We're also kicking around a light metallic blue, thinking of calling it Cutter Siren Chrome." We both laughed. He gave me a wave and headed off toward the beach. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the vast Pacific. The monstrous siren was now a trophy, covered by a tarp in the corner of my garage, a sleeping giant. I had moved here for peace and quiet, and I'd finally found it. Not by running from the crazy, not by fitting in, but by staring the crazy right in the eye and out-crazying it with a 140 decibel military-grade air horn. They say you can't fight City Hall, but they never said anything about fighting the Homeowners Association. And they definitely never said you couldn't win. Sometimes to get a little peace, you just have to make a whole lot of noise. I took another long, slow sip of my margarita. It tasted like victory.